Hello, everyone. Thank you so much. It always feels like a homecoming. Your group is uh, it's just warmth personified. So every time I get a request from David, I'm just excited to be included. So thank you. This month of February, I wanted to focus on subject matters in my own work and talks around love. And I had to laugh because I reflected back on the decades worth of talks around love and how many times have I done a Valentine's message and how many times have I done a series around that. But I actually love that kind of reflection because it ignites within me a sort of challenge that if I've talked about love or pursued the idea of outlining some methodology in order for us to dive deeper in understanding love, then there is always a way to go even further, the beyond the beyond. And so this month, as I was doing that, I came upon the idea of merging a series of talks on love with the shamanic medicine wheel and taking the four cardinal directions of the medicine wheel and applying that and emerging that to love. And today I concluded with the cardinal direction of the East. And it wasn't so much a question that was posited within that direction as much as it was a finalization that said, now it was, let me make sure I get the wording right, to visualize or vision how you want the next chapter of your life to be. And I had to smile to vision or visualize how you want the next chapter of your life to be, because it very much merged with one of my favorite teaching modalities that I have experimented with over the years. And so I'm going to share that modality with you today as we enter into closing the month of love, or February. So I am a big Neville Goddard fan. Are you familiar with Neville Goddard? Show of hands. Does anybody know who Neville Goddard was? Yay. So fresh newbies to give you introduction into Neville Goddard. Neville Goddard was one of the preeminent 20th century, early 20th century metaphysicians. I say early, he lived up into 1970 or whatever, but an incredible spiritual teacher, very prolific, many, many books. And one of the major publications that owned the rights to his material put all of his works together in one anthology, which I love, by the way. And so Neville Goddard's chief focus in almost all of his stuff was a metaphysical reinterpretation of scripture, but it always centered around the power and the focus of imagination. Everything was always geared around imagination. And so that was very appealing and actually very exciting. If you ever take the time to read any of Neville Goddard's works, watch and observe how you feel while you're reading it, because there is this pull of as if he's hand-holding you and saying, come on, expand your belief a little, return back to that origin inside of you of purity. At least that's how I always felt when I would study his stuff. I loved it so much that, I don't know, maybe 8 or 9 years ago, I devoted an entire summer to, when I was minister at Spiritual Living Center of Atlanta, to this book. And it still to this day, people talk about that summer and how much the book and the readings and the exercises helped them. So one of the things that was birthed from that era, and I'm going to read it to you, was just kind of a throwaway, actually. It's way, way in the bowels of the book. And he used this word called revisioning, just very kind of throwaway. And I'll tell you a little synopsis of what he said. He said it's a most healthy and productive exercise to daily relive the day as you wish you had lived it. So just hear the shift right there in the invitation or the instruction. It's a most healthy and productive exercise to daily relive the day as you wish you had lived it. So instead of beating yourself up how you wished you had lived it, that you use this limitless power called the imagination to sort of revision the activity of what happened. He said, revising the scenes to make them conform to your ideals. For instance, suppose today's mail brought disappointing news. Revise the letter, mentally rewrite it and make it conform to the news you wish you had received. Then in imagination, read the revised letter over and over again. This is the essence of revision, and revision results in repeal. He goes on to say, the one requisite is to arouse your attention in a way and to such intensity that you become wholly absorbed in the revision action. You will experience an expansion and a refinement of the senses by this imaginative exercise and eventually achieve such a vision. But always remember that the ultimate purpose of the exercise is to create in you, as he would say, the spirit of Jesus, or that Christ consciousness, which is continually in a state of forgiveness of any kind of quote, quote, sin or missing the mark. And he briefly describes something because he used to work a lot with individuals, and he would often share the case studies of the work that he would do. And so I thought about that. I thought about revising a letter, and something said to me, you could take this deeper, David. You could take the concept, which I loved, about taking this shared power, the shared commonality that we all have, which is the imagination, and begin to create a little bit of a structure to it that would help people uncover perhaps the predominant themes that are ruling their life. So I'm pretty sure I've shared with you in the past that I call those internal belief systems sort of themes. So quick example, one theme that every one of us, I guarantee you, has is, I don't have enough time. So I want you to stop and think about that and hear me when I say, there's no truth to that. There's actually no truth to the statement or the belief that I don't have enough time. What makes it true is the constant repetition by which we engage in that theme. And so by right of consciousness or by lawful living, our experience then becomes one of always feeling rushed and always frantic or feeling frazzled because of all the to-dos that we seemingly are behind in. But if you take a pause and you just listen for a second, there's no truth to the theme other than the fact that we have made it true by our repetitive visitation and adoption of it. Another one that I find interesting is, if I want something done right, I have to do it myself. Again, a very common shared theme. And what's fascinating about that is, again, there's no truth to it other than the fact that it has habitually become something that I have defaulted to. And here's a result of a theme like that. Highly competent people can be right in front of me, willing and eager to share their skill, and I will not be able to see it because of the theme that is non-consciously or subjectively running me, because I'm just so used to my loyalty to the theme that there isn't a willingness to stop and take a breath and to see that every single day someone skillful or someone helpful is right in front of me. And so that's an example of how wonderful it can be when you and I become curious as to why we do the things that we do, or why we continue marrying the same person in a different body, or why we continue gravitating to the same experience no matter where it is geographically that we move. And many of those things are just signals, if you will, that there are themes in there that are begging to be explored. And so when I thought about that, and I thought about the words of Neville Goddard around revisioning, I thought that's really kind of what he's talking about, but at a much deeper level. So it isn't about just rewriting a letter that came to you in the mail, but it's about stopping and contemplating your understanding of your innate power. And by innate power, I'm talking about the field of imagination. So ask yourself, go back to the beginning rudimentary understanding of what you know imagination to be. It is boundless. It has no precedence with regards to human defined time. It knows nothing except for what it is fed in terms of immediacy. So for example, oftentimes when we would teach and talk about affirmations or doing things like that nature, it was like the imagination doesn't know anything about past, present, or future. It only responds to what it's given in the immediacy of that moment. So for many of the kind of affirmative exercises, it's when we become accustomed to focusing on that rather than defaulting to non-conscious themes. The imagination isn't going, well, hey, wait a minute, you did this in the past. It's not keeping a scorecard. It's not holding a grudge. It has an immediate response to what it is fed. The imagination knows nothing about geography. It knows nothing about economy. It knows nothing about age. It is, as we would call, malleable and fluid, and it does not judge or hold a scorecard or any of those kinds of things. It's completely present. And so when you begin to stop and go, when was the last time that I actually even sat down and thought about my relationship with my imagination? You can begin to see and perhaps hear me when I say we're using it all the time. We use it every single day because we live greatly in a non-conscious mindset. So how many of you have gotten into the car and moved from point A to point B, got to point B, and thought, oh my God, I just moved machinery on on streets involving other people, and I was completely somewhere else. I was not focused on the rules of the road. I was not 100% fully aware. And again, that's just showing you how vast and how nuanced our relationship with imagination or the field of consciousness is. And I remember wanting to practice being more mindful. Years ago when I lived in LA, I had a little kitchen timer and it was like a little cow. And so I'd take the little cow kitchen timer in my car and I would set it for 5 minutes. And I would say, I'm going to practice being present and mindful while I'm driving. And I would set the timer and off I would go. And I swear to you, about a minute and a half into the driving, I would forget about the timer because something else would trigger some other kind of thought stream. And off I would go into a non-conscious default, just, movement. Sometimes I could be having an argument with someone from something that happened 10 years ago. That's how quickly these things are going. And when the 5-minute alarm would go off, I would inevitably be like jolt and be a little bit scared because I had forgotten. And I would be very, very harsh to myself. And I'd go, my God, David, you can't even stay conscious for 5 minutes. And then I'd practice taking a breath and I became more compassionate, but also more curious. more curious to that power, that collaborative power, that if I was able to be in cooperation with my awareness and use it deliberately, that then even though there's so much of it being used non-consciously, where might I arrive at a tipping point? Where might I arrive, let's say, at a 51% of that? And I thought the only way that I know that I could do that would be through practice, some type of practice and curiosity as to why there are these repetitive things and circumstances that continue. What are the themes that are there? Because those themes are built from what? All of that non-conscious noise and density of layers that are packed into what has happened to us in our life. So I read Neville Goddard, I see the word revisioning, and I feel this sort of electricity go through my body. And I went, this is it. Something wants to be birthed from here. So I thought, this is an excellent way for you and I to go exploring with regards to what might be some non-conscious themes that are still very masterfully ruling our behavior in present time. And so I began to think about what would the rules of this work be. And the first one that became self-evident as I began to workshop this a lot was, unless we have some relationship with gratitude, the exercise won't work. Why? Because if we are imprisoned by or a servant of the event in such a way that we are below sort of like that futile despair line, then we would carry that energy into the exercise and it would really not advance anything. There's got to be a willingness where we can reflect back on an incident, a pain, a wounding, and yet still be able to hold gratitude because that event somehow got us to where we are right now. I know you understand that, and I'm sure you've been instructed to do that many, many times. That when you look at where you are, you look at the fact that you're in this community called Unity of San Jose. It is those events that actually played a role in you being a part of this community. So that is a form of, can I find some shred of willingness and gratitude for what happened? So that's kind of the base. The next is understanding that I can't undermine or change the free will of another individual. So if the circumstance involved another person, which they always do, if the person died, if the person harmed us, if there was some action on their part, the exercise isn't to change their behavior. This is where I deviated from what Goddard was saying about changing the news and the letter. It isn't about changing the behavior of the perpetrator or the response of the person. And so we have to then see that what we are about to revision is our response. And so we go about opening ourselves up to a memory and basically kind of allowing ourselves to pick the first ones that come to mind and not over censoring those. And then we go about the process of these questions. Number one was, what were the circumstances? So I'm going to just throw you a few case histories that I think really explain this, and then invite you to consider using this because it's very worthwhile. So number one, what were the circumstances? So I was at a Unity Ministers Conference that I was teaching at Unity Village years ago. And it was a multi-day event. So that night, I gave the instructions that I just gave to you to this room full of Unity ministers. And I said, I want you to pick an event in your life that that made an impact on you, that you think about. And I want you to trust that one. Just pick the one that first comes to you. And then decide, what were the circumstances? See if you can, through your senses, smell, taste, touch, see everything that went around. Then reflect on what your response was. And understanding a little, rudimentary, a little about what revisioning is, how might you revision your response to that? And I said, don't worry about any other thing and bring your results back in the morning and we'll discuss it. So everybody went home. The next morning, we started again and I recovered the material. And I said, does anybody have anything to share? And this woman minister, she shot her hand up immediately. And I said, yes. And she says, oh, I have something. And I said, what is that? And she said, my mother had my sister and I when she was very young. So that by the time I was 8 and my sister was 7, she was still in her late 20s. So she was a young woman and she still felt very vital, and she was a single mom. And so she really still wanted to socialize and party and do all of the things that people do. And she said her practice was then to put my sister and I to bed. And the point of view from my bed was I could see our driveway. And so I would see, she'd put us to bed, and then I would see her car back out of the driveway and leave. And she said, I would sit up until she came home. And sometimes I would sit up until 2 in the morning. And no one told me to do that, but this sense of responsibility, perhaps fear, came over me that what if she doesn't come back? And so it was like I was a sentinel kind of standing guard over my baby sister until she came home. And when I saw the car lights come back into the driveway, I would lay my head down. And I said, wow. I said, so that memory, how did you then go about revisioning that? And she said, well, I could see the pajamas. I could see that old point of view of the driveway. I could see the street light. I could see the headlights of her car. And there she was. She pulled out and she left. And I said, and then what did you do? She said, I just laid down and went to sleep. And we had to laugh because she was explaining that what grew from that action was a sense of over-responsibilitizing. She admitted to all of her peers that she was the control freak, that she had this church, and that she had to be the one to turn the lights on and off. She had to be the one to make sure that the bathrooms were clean. She was the one that had to make sure that all of the chairs were straightened. And she said that control, that need to control, and she goes, and I could be aware of it, but it was as if I was helpless to it. She said, I saw that control stemmed from me sitting in that bed, watching my mother leave, and thinking that somehow I had to control the safety of this environment. And she said, so just laying down and going to bed was a sort of action of releasing that control. So here's the beautiful thing about revisioning. We have often said the phrase, what's done is done. And revisioning challenges that, because we're talking about human time, linear time, which would bring validation to a motto that what's done is done. But when you're talking about the imagination and you're talking about an exercise like revisioning, then that motto is not applicable anymore. Because what we have now begun to understand is that there's a quantum field of activity where time is irrelevant, and that the human construct of time is only, again, as valid as we make it. So to revision means that you throw all of that out and you are there in that moment. And by the mere action of making an adjustment, even if it's a 1% adjustment, you are affecting the way in which that implements and influences your behavior today. Just a simple modification. There's another book, I thought I might have it here on my desk, that is super popular right now, and it's called Atomic Habits. Any of you read Atomic Habits? Again, highly recommended, but the author talks about that atomic atoms, small little tiny adjustments, even if they're measured and considered to be 1%, make an incredible impact on the shifts and changes that happen in your life. Just really side note quickly, he gives an example of the British cycling team that for over 100 years was the worldwide laughing joke in terms of cycling. And somehow he became coach manager, and he was very much a mind of this kind of work. And he began to make what he called 1% or atomic adjustments in the way in which the team was managed. Everything from changing the color on the walls to a different color that would pick up and help him microscopically see any kind of dust or bacteria that might inhibit the rider's breathing. He investigated what was a better fabric for breathability for their riding outfits. He went and talked to bicycle manufacturing companies about what is the cutting edge seat that helps bring more mobility. He explored what the new types of muscle massage manipulation that would help recovery areas. It showed the riders that he was invested in them, but it also showed that even things that seem inconsequential, when all put together, create a different result. And guess what happened? And there's a list of these little 1% adjustments. They began to win. And then they ended up winning 2 Tour de France's, and they began to place gold in the Olympics. And all of it was just mind-boggling to read how it all came from one little influence to begin to 1% adjust. I see that with revisioning. Sometimes we think, well, it's going to be this big cosmic shift right away. But something like revisioning is an example of a method that we can use to become more mindful and more collaborative and more empowering with this tool of imagination that is absolutely free and at our disposal. So what were the circumstances? Her mother would pull out of the driveway. How did she respond? She would sit up all night until she came home. And then how did she revision? She saw herself relax and lay down and go to sleep. And I talked to her a year later, and she said from that moment on, she became more and more comfortable, or actually, she said, more willing to delegate, to let people help, to do things, even though that need to control would flare up. She was aware, and she would smile and go, oh my God, because she thought about her 8-year-old self. It was powerful. Another case study that I pulled up in here was a young girl who was 9, and her parents kicked her older brother out when he was 16. He had done something that reviled his parents, who were super fundamentalist Christian. And so they would not allow him to come back into the home. Her mother went so far as removing all of his photos from the house. And every night, her mother would make her get on her knees to pray about her wayward, sinful brother, to bring him home to Jesus. And this went on for years. And I think she said about 4 years later, when she was a teenager, she got a call that her brother's fiance wanted to come and meet her parents. And she remembers the conversation, and she remembers her mother saying, well, maybe this is not such a bad thing, because maybe we can win her over and influence your brother to come back to Christ. And they made her sit in on this meeting. And she said the meeting went on for well over 2 hours. And the mother was just divisive and commanding. And she said she observed, she couldn't take her eyes off of this fiance because the fiance just smiled and was super kind to her mother. But she would not deviate from her love for her brother. She wouldn't side with the mother. She would only counter her responses with love. And she said it was the first time that I realized maybe my mother is wrong. Maybe all of this action that I have been put through is not right. Maybe my brother is a good person. And she said that that was the circumstances. And she said her response from the memory of that fiance coming to the house was she just sat frozen in fear. But when she practiced revisioning, because she had a sense of self as a teenage girl, she stood up. She saw herself stand up at the end of their sort of interrogation meeting and go over and hug the fiance and tell her how much she appreciated her coming over, and that if she loved her brother, that her brother must be a good person. And she kept seeing herself doing this over and over again. And she said that what that began to show is that she had this habit of always acquiescing and believing and doing what other people told her to do, even when it didn't feel right. And again, stemming from this overbearing mother doing all of this stuff. And I've got case study after case study after case study here about the power of being willing to go back and to look at these things from a loving place. So the steps are, what are the circumstances? What was my response? And how can I begin to revision? A little thing here. Many of those memories contain a lot of time and involvement when we were very young, when we were very fragile, and we did not necessarily have the wherewithal to quote revision or do anything differently. And that was a great regularity and a great experience. And it was wonderful to be able to discuss and go, okay, does that mean then that even that event is exempt from revisioning? And I allowed us to work together because all of this came through long-standing classes and workshops to get to a concise way to do with this. And what felt right and what ended up being very helpful for people with those memories was this. If then we can't change the free will of another individual, if time also is not linear, then that means that as that event is occurring, this older self is also present in the activity. And so for many of us, what we did is we created an event where even though the thing happened, this guardian angel type presence, which was us, came to nurture the younger self of us in that moment during that event when we felt all alone. There's a beautiful one in here where a kid wanted to please his father so badly, that he hauled out the lawnmower, even though the lawnmower was twice his size, and tried to mow the grass, and he just couldn't finish, and he completed half of it. And his father raged at him for being inept and not completing anything. And he saw that that cycled within him a workaholic nature that he had to overdo and overdo and overdo and overdo, and it all came crashing down in his 40s. But he was able to link that behavior to the fact that it was about that unfinished job and seeking approval from his dad. And so when we were talking about what could you do in that moment, he said, I was so young and so helpless. So he imagined adult self coming over to him as the child and rewarding him and telling him what a great attempt, what a great job that you wanted to help. And he just kept practicing that particular thing over and over and over again. And so that is but one way that you and I can take something that is already innate within us and use to our benefit to come home to infinite potentiality, to become curious about our behavior and to lift ourselves up to a different, more powerful relationship with the way in which we want to vision or visualize the next chapters of our life. Why recycle the old when something infinitely much more empowering is right in front of us? Thank you all for listening.